This one's a little bit different. This one involves the identification of the Fire Island Jane Doe, but she's also known as Gilgo Beach victim number 7. I wasn't sure the best way to present this. I generally don't cover serial cases. I do focus on Jane Does who are identified. And with this one, they're all kind of wound up together. A lot of the facts in this case have been released along with information about the Gilgo Beach perpetrator, who has been identified as Rex Heuermann. But this video is not so much about him. It's about the people affected by him, rather than why a psychopath chose to do something unforgivable. And of course, there are questions as to whether or not he was responsible for all of the victims that ended up being found in this case. It started with women going missing as early as 2007, and later on that date would even be pushed back to 1996. Initially, the first known break in this case happened when a woman named Shannon Gilbert escaped from a client near Gilgo Beach, which is located on Long Island in the New York City area. That Shannon Gilbert was missing would come to light when her boyfriend reported that she had not returned home. We know now that she fled in fear from the man she was meeting on May 1st, 2010, but nobody actually knew she was missing for 2 days after that. It would come out that she was working as an escort, but she had a driver that night who was supposed to be looking out for her. But after the events of that evening, we know now that he took off because cops had become involved. And apparently he was far more worried for himself than he was for Shannon. Her family was open that Shannon was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and she'd been struggling. Her family would fear that when it came out that she was selling her services through Craigslist, that people wouldn't care or look for her. But one thing they didn't know at first is the police were actually already looking for Shannon, although they didn't know Shannon's name. Shannon herself placed a 911 call from Joseph Brewer's home at 4:51 a.m. Although what she said on the call didn't make a lot of sense. She would say that someone is after her. And in the background, they heard the voice of Joseph Brewer, who was the client. And they also heard the voice of the man who would later be determined as the one who was supposed to be looking out for her and had driven her there in the first place. But no one knows exactly what happened. Shannon fled on foot and she started going to neighbors' houses and knocking. She would end up at a neighbor's door shortly after that, but the neighbor did answer, which isn't always the case when someone starts pounding on your door. He brought her into his home and he tried to help her. Unfortunately, she wasn't saying anything that made any sense, and he then made the second 911 call involving Shannon Gilbert that night. And while the neighbor tried to keep her still and safe until the police arrived, Shannon took off out the door again. At one point, she was spotted hiding under a boat and running in the area. She also knocked on more doors, and it was around this time that the driver disappeared.
State police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
You're driving right now?
No, I'm inside the house.
I'm sorry?
I'm inside the house.
What house?
I don't know. Can you trace where I am?
I'm sorry?
Can you trace where I am?
No, I can't. What's your callback number you're calling from?
Please.
Go that way, please. Come on, let's go. Come on, roll that side. Come on, go outside. Come on, all of us. Come on, roll that side. Come on.
No, please.
Well, I don't know, but it was transferred to me.
Why?
No.
Please, you gonna tell me?
It came into, I think it's Suffolk County on the number transfer to the county won't answer me.
Tell me? Why are you gonna...
Call Suffolk number.
You freaking down, come on.
I'm in the middle of nowhere.
Let's go back to Manhattan, all right? We're in Long Island. We're out near the water.
Please, stop.
Me, Mike. Brother, come on.
No, stop it, please. You're being sarcastic about this. You're a part of this all along.
Oh, I can manage it now.
Shannon then ran from Brewer's house at 8 the fairway to Gus Coletti's house at 17 the fairway, a distance of 0.2 of a mile.
Don't keep yourself hurt. Where are you going? Wait a minute. Where are you going? Where are you going?
She then runs from Coletti's home, prompting Coletti to call 911. After Coletti's call, Shannon then runs another 0.2 of a mile to another home at 43 the Bayou, prompting a third 911 call made at 5:30 a.m. by Barbara Brennan.
Suffolk Police 873 was location of emergency.
Yes, I live at Oak Beach in the association. There's a young girl about 14 years old running around here screaming, and there's some guy trying to follow her.
This is kind of an abbreviated rundown of Shannon's events. There is a link in the description below in order to find out more information if you're curious about Shannon, because Shannon matters too. Although Shannon doesn't appear to be one of the Gilgo victims, her case helped the police realize what was going on. Those who saw Shannon that night described her as being erratic and terrified, and it took a few days before they realized that the missing person report filed on Shannon was for the same person that the police were trying to find on Long Island. And it's pretty clear that the police tried really hard to find Shannon, but because she was running and no one knew exactly where she went, it was difficult to know where to even look. But they did the best they could, and while they didn't find Shannon, they found the remains of 4 other women who were also working as escorts who, like Shannon, had seemingly disappeared into thin air. So then this kind of brings us back to Joseph Brewer. And he was the man who had answered Shannon's advertisement on Craigslist, the one that she was running from that started all of this. He was 47 at the time and an unemployed financial advisor who had recently split with his wife, and he was living on Oak Beach in Long Island. He made a lot of unlikely claims that were meant to make him look innocent. He claimed that while Shannon was at his home for 2 hours, no relations between the two were ever had, and that he didn't pay for anything. He would later claim he wanted her to leave and she refused, and that was what the problem was. It doesn't appear he directly had anything to do with what was discovered or even the demise of Shannon. Although, of course, but for what happened there, she wouldn't have been running. While searching for Shannon, the searchers made the discovery of 4 women. These women would eventually be labeled the Gilgo Four. The ones that were discovered at this point were Megan Waterman, who was 22 when she went missing, Melissa Bartholomew, who was 24, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, who was 25, and Amber Lynn Costello, who was the oldest at 27. So here are their stories. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was the first of the original 4 women to go missing. She was living 3 hours away from New York in Norwich, Connecticut. She was last seen by her family and friends on July 9th, 2007. She was a 25-year-old mom who was struggling to pay her rent and was having trouble keeping food on the table for her 2 kids. And for this reason, she resorted to placing ads in order to make money. This desperation would eventually lead her to board a train on and off and make the 3-hour trip to New York. Her sister would later make a point of announcing to the world that her sister was a good person and that while she was working as an escort, it wasn't ever her sister's plan. And it's probably something really important to take to heart. I don't think any little girl ever dreams of meeting men through ads in a newspaper as a means to make money. Maureen's sister would go on to say that her sister needs a voice and she deserves her pride back, pointing out that people respected her as a single mom before it came out what she was doing to earn money, and that she still deserves that original respect, saying that she was so much more than what she was being diminished to in many of the reports, saying that if Maureen had a penny in her pocket that someone else needed, she would give it to them. She was a good person who was just desperate, and that desperation led to what would end up ending her life. Her sister also wanted everyone to know that Maureen had been applying for jobs. She was looking at things like data entry and call centers. What she resorted to was just a job to her, and she planned to put it behind her as soon as possible. But unfortunately, it would lead her to a Super 8 hotel in Manhattan, and that was the last place she would be seen. Her sister would say it was traumatizing for her family, especially for the 2 kids. and they had a daunting task of trying to find her. And of course, this is a city of over 8 million people. So her sister decided to start by reporting her missing in Connecticut and telling the police what happened. But the police were less than kind about placing a report, and they refused. They would instead imply that Maureen didn't care about her children and walked away on purpose. But her sister kept trying to place the missing person report, and when it didn't happen there, they tried to do it in New York City, but also it was a refusal. So they took to the streets and started handing out photos of Maureen, and nobody they ran into recognized her at all. And of course, despite the Connecticut police assertion that she ran away on purpose and didn't care about her kids, the truth was much worse. No one would know her fate until December of 2011, when the remains of those 4 women were found, all wrapped in burlap sacks. So this takes us to Melissa. Melissa Bartholomew was the second of the original 4 to disappear. She disappeared on July 12, 2009. She had graduated from beauty school in her hometown of Buffalo, New York. She would eventually move to the New York City area, but then she abruptly stopped contacting her family, and that wasn't normal for her. Her mom became fearful when Melissa seemingly disappeared, and she also would contact the police with the goal of making a missing person report. But once again, the police would refuse to take one. And of course, the lack of these reports is why it's so hard then to match up the remains they find later, because they're looking, ironically, at missing person reports. The police would tell her that at 24, Melissa was an adult who was not on antipsychotic medications. Not sure why that's a distinction, but that was the distinction that they made. They would then announce Melissa was where she wanted to be, and there was nothing the mother or the police could do about it, which is pretty disturbing since we know now that she didn't choose to be a victim and she didn't choose to be lost out there. Her mom would keep calling the police day after day trying. Nothing happened. They still wouldn't take a report. She then hired a lawyer to try to force them to take a report, and it still didn't happen. They still refused. Then disturbing calls began coming in. A man on the other end would describe to her family the acts that he was performing on Melissa, insinuating she was still alive and that he had her. Although once these calls happened, the police did begin to listen, and they did actually take a missing person report at that point. They would try to trace the calls, but the man hung up too soon every time, although they were able to tell that the calls had come from somewhere midtown Manhattan. So it seemed pretty possible that it was in fact somebody who had done something to Melissa. The third woman of the Gilgo Four to disappear did so on June 6, 2010. This was Megan Waterman, who was also a young mother, doing her best to put a roof over her 4-year-old child's head. It's pretty consistent along these stories that these women were desperate for money. She would actually end up at the same Holiday Inn Express on Long Island, involved in another one of the cases. Megan usually had someone who would accompany her also on these calls. It doesn't specifically say, but I'm guessing that person was Akeem Cruz, who was her boyfriend at the time and appeared to have had the idea of placing the Craigslist ads. Megan was just 22 in 2010, and her mother would say that the world lost an awesome girl, describing her as a wonderful mom and a good friend. Amber Costello would become the fourth of the original 4. Amber disappeared on September 2nd, 2010, which is, of course, just a few months after Megan Waterman, and this would be just 3 months before the group of 4 women were found. 27-year-old Amber, it would turn out, wasn't reported missing, and there's no indication anyone tried, although it's entirely possible, going with the theme of this, that they wouldn't have taken the report anyway. In this case, Amber's roommate would explain that she just walked out one day from their home on Long Island. She would say that Amber was placing ads on Craigslist, and that Amber was meeting someone who responded the day that she disappeared. Her roommate actually knew a lot of information about what was going on, so it's kind of surprising she didn't report Amber missing or try. She would share with the police that Amber had originally passed on the person who answered the ad, but that person kept offering more money, which of course is easy to do if you don't plan on paying it. Amber would eventually accept the offer of $1,500, which was 3 or 4 times the rate Amber normally made. So this was her incentive to cave in and meet the man. But she would say that Amber had no signs of being nervous, although it was odd that Amber didn't take her phone or her purse with her when she left. Amber, like the others, usually had someone go with her, and for some reason she chose not to that night. It's not clear what was said or if she knew the person calling, but she may have been familiar with the person as she went alone without the phone. The police, after finding these 4 women, were pretty concerned that there may have been more. And of course, they still didn't know what happened to Shannon. So they began searching with canine search teams on March 29, 2011. A woman's partial remains were found and labeled as Jane Doe 5. Jane Doe 5 would later be identified as Jessica Taylor. Jessica's hands and skull were found along the Ocean Parkway, which was near Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach. This would be about a mile within the first of the 4 women who were found, but of course it was only partial. DNA was taken, and it would eventually prove to investigators that Jessica was already a Jane Doe. Some of her remains were found in Suffolk County back in July of 2003 when a woman was out walking her dog. Those remains were pretty disturbing. They were found in the woods with her hands and head missing, and she was sort of bound up in what was described as a circle. Once they finally identified her, it would come out that Jessica, too, was working out of Manhattan, New York, and she was just 20 years old in 2003. Jessica was from Poughkeepsie, New York, and she had moved to Brooklyn with a man named Khalil White, and he went by the nickname of Remy. He began taking advantage and pushing her to sell herself before she was even a legal adult. It doesn't specifically say, but it appears she was a runaway. But she'd been expressing to everyone around her that she didn't want to do what she was doing. Someone was pushing her to do it, and she was having a hard time walking away, although it's not clear if there were threats. But whatever it was that she wanted to do to get away, she didn't get a chance. She'd been working the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan between July 18th and July 21st, around the time that she disappeared. It would turn out that the disturbing scene where they found the majority of her body originally wasn't the only one. It would turn out that in that case, hers were the second remains found in that same general area, in that same general fashion. In 2000, the torso of another victim was found the same way, tied up in the same area. The reason I mention her second is the Gilgo investigation didn't yet know about her. But with the remains of Jessica, they would then tie her into the case, and in that case, the woman's name was Valerie Mack, and she was 24 when her life was taken. She, too, was a mother of a young child. Valerie was found first on November 19, 2000, and then on April 4, 2011. She had actually gone missing from Port Republic, New Jersey around spring or summer of 2000. I've included the booking photo of Valerie here, which I usually don't do, but this one has been widely distributed and it's really familiar to me, so I suspect it is to others. It also makes me really sad. If you look at the healthy pictures of her before this happened, it's clear she was having a hard time, and I bet some sort of illegal substances were involved, but I don't have proof of that. But I think what's striking is she looks what is probably best described as haunted, very much like a different person from her younger photos. So in this case, she too was found close to the remains of another person, and then again, more of her remains on Gilgo Beach. And the search kept going on for Shannon. They still didn't know where Shannon Gilbert was, but they would eventually locate her remains on Oak Beach, about 3 miles away from the first Gilgo women. Her death was initially ruled as an accidental drowning, but her family contests this. They paid for an independent autopsy, and the conclusion there was asphyxiation. Well, it was a little more graphic, but I can't say those words here on YouTube. But they did say that it pointed to foul play. Her family has been very adamant it's linked to the other women, but for now, she's not included in the count of those that are linked together. If it's true, she would end up being victim 11 in the end.
As part of BAU's review of the case, they retained the services of a psychiatrist to review Shannon's words and actions on the 911 tape, and also to review the facts of the case. BAU's opinion, based on their review of Shannon's case, the scene, the 911 calls, and a psychiatrist review, is that Shannon Gilbert's death is not consistent with Shannon being the victim of violence or of a violent offender. Significant differences between Shannon's death and the circumstances surrounding the other victims' deaths were also highlighted by BAU. The Suffolk County Police Department is open to evaluate any evidence to be able to help us and all involved determine a definite cause of death. However, based on the evidence, the facts, and the totality of the circumstances, the prevailing opinion is that Shannon's death, while tragic, was not a murder and is most likely an accident. While we are of the opinion that this was an unfortunate accident, we remain open to evaluate any information that the public may have.
The important thing to remember with these young women is circumstances were at play against them. I feel like I have to say that. Sometimes there's mean comments, but I don't think anyone grows up and wants to do this. And in a lot of the cases, if you look back, they didn't seem to have a safety net. I know at least in my personal life, I kept moving back home when I'd lose a roommate. I suspect in a lot of these cases, they were then just homeless if they didn't have the money to pay for rent. And a lack of a safety net is a big deal, especially at that age. I realize it also includes personal choices, but I hope people will be cognizant of the fact that likely nobody wanted this to be their life, and they paid for it in the end. One thing I didn't mention about the case of Valerie is that she lost both of her parents at a young age. Maybe that's why it breaks my heart a little bit extra. Again, no safety net. So now we have those 6 cases as well as Shannon, and we have to switch gears a little bit back to when the first 2 torsos were found, and then some of Valerie's remains in bags on Gilgo Beach. Just like with Jessica Taylor, it would take DNA to tie Valerie Mack's skull and hands from Gilgo Beach along to the remains that were originally found earlier. There's a certain irony in the fact that the perpetrator removed parts likely to keep them from being identified, but all it did was tie that person back to Gilgo Beach, where a lot of remains were found. Before I jump to the recent Jane Doe identification from these cases, I need to quickly touch on the remaining John and Jane Does found on Gilgo Beach at this same time, and they have yet to be identified. The first one was also found in more than one place. She's often referred to as Peaches because she had a peach tattoo, and DNA would tie her to a young victim that was also found on Gilgo Beach. It would turn out Peaches was the mother of the young daughter. Peaches Doe would have gone missing around 1997. Peaches' torso was first found on June 28, 1997 in Lakeview, New York, near Hempstead Lake State Park. What is depicted is a heart-shaped peach that was located on her left breast. So it seems pretty obvious to me anyway that the torsos that were found with the other parts on Gilgo Beach are at least probably one perpetrator. But there is no way to know that these are all tied together. That's what's so weird about it. In the case of Peaches, she was likely either black or of mixed race. Her torso was found inside of a Rubbermaid container in 1982, which is of course far prior to the discovery of the rest of her remains in 2011. And for whatever reason, her daughter's remains were found on Gilgo Beach, not with the initial discovery of her mother. So this would mean the daughter was likely born around 1994 to 1996. And if the other cases are a sign, she was likely from New York or the surrounding area. Her DNA is currently on hold. The closest relative right now is Elijah Howard or Howell from Pritchard, Alabama, but he passed away in 1963. They're waiting on DNA that is more current. That's why those public databases are such a big deal. The other remaining case is listed as a John Doe. It appears this Doe was possibly trans, and they believe our Doe's life was possibly taken when that discovery was made. They lost their life likely around 2001 to 2006 and is listed as the result of a beating, around 5'6" or 167 centimeters. And they place the age from 17 to 23. So if this is correct, it would mean the family is missing someone born between 1978 to 1989. And this is because the postmortem interval is around 5 to 10 years. So that has to be factored in. But as always, just remember it's an estimate. And then this leads to our latest Jane Doe identification. The Fire Island Jane Doe, or Jane Doe 7, has been identified by DNA as Karen Vergata. And her remains, like many of the others, were found in 2 different places. She was technically the 7th Gilgo Jane Doe. Her first remains were found in 1996 off the shoreline of Blue Point Beach on Fire Island in Davis Park. It was here that her legs were found inside of a black plastic bag. It was determined that they belonged to a woman who'd had a recent pedicure, and her toenails were painted red. She had a 3.5-inch scar that was found mid-leg, and 2 surgical scars on her left ankle that led them to believe she'd had ankle surgery. They estimated her age as 18 to 50, which is so wide it's not very helpful. But of course, they did the best they could with what little they had. And because there was so little, there was really nothing they could do to try to discover who the woman was. That was until 2010 and 2011, when almost 15 years later, when her skull was located in the same general area as the Gilgo Four. She was actually in the second group of remains that were found, as they kept expanding their search. But because they had a skull, they were finally able to do a recreation. And we know now, thanks to Othram Labs, that Karen Ann Vergata was 34 when she went missing from her apartment in Hell's Kitchen. It's described as a then gritty neighborhood in Manhattan, New York. It appears that Hell's Kitchen is now pretty safe, but it wasn't always that way, and it definitely was not in February of 1996 when she went missing. They know that it was on Valentine's Day. She had placed a call to her father to say happy birthday. Her family kept looking and kept trying to find her, but she seemed to disappear without a trace, and of course there was no reason to suspect that the legs that were found belonged to her. They would make it clear that Karen was a really good person. She had struggled a lot, and she'd found herself afoul of the legal system more than once. A friend of hers she graduated high school with in 1979 remembers her as a good person and an aspiring artist. Her family remembers her as someone who loved her kids but struggled to care for them. She had given birth to 2 boys, but she hadn't seen them since 1992, which at the time she went missing was about 4 years. It's hard not to imagine how painful it would have to be to lose your children, even if the situation is better for the kids. So likely it affected her mental health in some form too. Thankfully, we do know that those kids were adopted out of the system together by a foster mother who had fallen in love with both of them. So while Karen wasn't able to see her kids anymore, she did visit her brother and her father often, and they did know that she was working as an escort. And because of how she was making her money, they were increasingly worried about her, especially when she went missing. They were sure something bad had happened after Karen was able to get bail money back that she had posted for a friend, and she didn't show up to claim the money. A local police officer was familiar with Karen, and he would share that he hadn't seen her in months either. Her father would try to file a missing person report, but like the others in this case, the police wouldn't take it. Her family was clear that no matter what challenges she had, they loved her. They were pushing the police to try to find Karen. They just needed to know what happened to her. It was around this time that they learned of an unidentified woman in Suffolk County. While it doesn't specifically say, I suspect that actually was the remains of Jessica Taylor, which were ironically in some way related to Karen's case. Her family would give their DNA to compare, but were told it wasn't a match. But what infuriates me is they take family DNA from missing people and they keep it in quotas usually, and they didn't do that in this case. So they had the DNA and they later would have been able to make a match, but it didn't happen. This was likely because the police would tell Karen's family that they were positive Karen was alive and chose purposely to cut off contact. This sort of fits into the conversation we had on another video where I had a lot of complaints about my anger at the police not taking a report or looking for someone who was missing. And so before it starts here, I want to say I know that there's 8 million people in New York, and I'm sure it makes a lot of work if someone's reported missing. But if that was at least taken note of, many of these cases could have been solved. Not in the way the families wanted, but they would at least know. And I think for me, that's the unforgivable part. It's the police that have control of this, and the denial of being willing to accept missing persons reports has actually affected cases, many cases. And then what really makes me so angry about this case is the police would report later, when they made the identification, that Karen wasn't reported missing. Well, duh. But whose fault was that? And that implies the family, and that really bothers me. Her family, for their part, countered and made sure people knew that they tried to report her missing and it wasn't allowed. They would actually have her finally declared deceased in 2015. They were sure something had happened to her. They just needed to know what. So then this all falls to who did this. Did one person do this? Did multiple people do this? We know that Rex Herman has been arrested. So I feel like I have to mention him a little bit, but I don't want this video to be about him. But we know he was an architect living in Massapequa Park, which is an area in Nassau County on Long Island. He's only been charged with 3 so far: Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. But he's actually linked in with all of the Gilgo Four, and of course, all 4 were found wrapped up in burlap. So I think it's pretty clear those 4 were at least tied together. And in these cases, calls were being placed to torment the families from burner phones, and that was actually what caught him. So the call I mentioned earlier that was in an article, so it appears it wasn't the only family getting calls. They were able to use the burner phones and the phone numbers that came from them to eventually link them to a Tinder profile that he was also using. They were able to legally confiscate his burner phones. Within them, they were able to find that he had kept searching for what was found with the Gilgo cases. He was also making searches for sadistic and explicit photos involving females. I can't actually say on YouTube the ages of them, but even though I can't use the P word, let's just say he was looking for women young and old. And on those Gilgo victims, they found male and female hairs that were consistent with each other on at least 3 of the decedents. I'm guessing it's the 3 charged, but it doesn't specifically say. And from this, they were able to get his DNA. It doesn't appear that they've specifically identified the female hairs and who they belong to, but it's believed that they belong to his wife. Although I need to say there's absolutely no indication she was involved. They believe he did what he did inside of his family home, and that was probably how the hairs ended up on there, and why they were wrapped in burlap, likely to aid with removal. So the question remains as to whether or not he took the lives of everybody found, or if it was just that subset of 4 people. Clearly, the cases that were found earlier and then partial remains on Gilgo Beach, they seem tied together, but it's not as clear if they're tied to the Gilgo Four, if that makes sense. I would love to see what you guys think, whether or not you think they're all tied together. If there's 3 perpetrators, it's really hard to say. Honestly, if I had to guess, I think there's at least 2 perpetrators. And of course, this keeps unfolding, and hopefully they'll be able to find out more. At the press conference announcing Karen's identification, the police representative stated it's important that we remember and honor not only Karen Vergata, but all of the victims on Gilgo Beach. The sad thing is all these women were pretty young, and many of them had children and family members who kept searching. Peaches and her daughter have gone unidentified for 26 years. The Gilgo Beach John Doe, also known as John Doe 8, has gone unidentified for 12. Maureen Brainard-Barnes' life was taken in 2007. Had she lived, Maureen would be 41 years old today. Melissa Bartholomew's life was taken in 2009. Had she lived, Melissa would be 38 years old today. Megan Waterman's life was taken in 2010. Had Megan lived, she would be 35 years old today. Amber Lynn Costello's life was taken in 2010. Had Amber lived the life she deserved, she would be 40 years old today. Valerie Mack was herself a Jane Doe, going unidentified for 19 years. Had Valerie lived, she would be 47 years old today. Jessica Taylor's life was taken in 2003. Had Jessica lived, she would be 40 years old today. Karen Vergata's life was taken in 1996. Had she lived, Karen would be 62 years old today. Karen went unidentified for 27 years. Shannon Gilbert passed away in 2010. Had she lived, Shannon would be 37 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. I gain only about 350 subs a month. So if you consistently watch my videos, maybe take a moment to subscribe. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.